So I'm delighted to at least be able to join you remotely and to share some thoughts and reflections on the concept of poverty in Islam. I want to first give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So I started out in Islamic studies in Tübingen in Germany a long time ago, and then moved to North America and ended up in anthropology. So my conceptual and methodological home now is really what is called the anthropology of Islam. The reason I've thought much about poverty is that I've done a multi-year ethnographic study on Islamic charity in Egypt, which resulted in my book, Giving to God. Now, being situated in the anthropology of Islam, for me, like for many of my colleagues, means being interested in how things are negotiated on the ground, but also in the pull that Islam has as what Talal Asad has called a discursive tradition. So a tradition that is grounded in the Qur'an and Hadith. So in this spirit, what I will do today is try to draw together some aspects from the Qur'an and the Hadith, but also some ethnographic insights and questions. And in doing so, I want to address 4 topics. Let me share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So what I would like to talk about in the time that I have is first addressing different views on poverty. So the very question of whether poverty is a good thing, a bad thing, or neither. I want to speak a little bit about how poverty is defined in the Islamic tradition. Then turn to the question of how to respond to poverty, namely addressing the ethics of charity. And then turn to spiritual poverty, getting us to think beyond material framings, and also circling back to the question of asceticism and voluntary poverty. So starting then with different views on poverty that we find in the Islamic tradition. Again, this question, is poverty a good thing or a bad thing or neither? I want to begin with a puzzle from my fieldwork. Sorry, this is the image I want to show you for now. So this is an image from my fieldwork in Cairo with an Islamic charity organization that's volunteer-run, and volunteers engage in a range of activities. One of these activities is cooking meals and taking them to poor neighborhoods and distributing them to poor people in these neighborhoods, called it'am in Arabic, the giving of food. And on the way to these neighborhoods, the volunteers very often on the charity organization's bus will discuss the question, what it means to give to the poor, why we give to the poor, how we ought to give to the poor. And one view that's commonly expressed in these kinds of contexts is that Islam is the ideal cure for poverty. So if everyone gave zakāt, obligatory alms, or also more broadly, if everyone engaged in an Islamic ethics of giving, there actually wouldn't be any poverty. So, if everyone gave zakāt, then we would root out poverty from society, or if scaled up, the imaginary sometimes becomes that then there wouldn't be any poverty globally. So here, poverty is something to be overcome. And one can imagine from within this a world without poor people. But this stands against another common claim, which is that there will always be poor people. And not only that, but we need the poor. So this is in line with a larger idea that's shared across the monotheistic religions. Poverty is treated as a given. The poor will always be with us. Mark Cohen writes about how Jewish and Christian scriptures also recognize poverty as an inherent part of the human condition. So in this sense, in medieval times, for instance, giving was about the spiritual welfare of the givers and not about eliminating poverty, right? There wasn't this idea of, let's imagine a world free of poverty. In Islamic contexts too, the poor are often treated as a given. And again, the poor are needed because they can help us get into paradise. So the logic here, the poor don't need us, we need the poor, is that the poor don't need us because ultimately it is God who provides. And we only channel what is provided. But we need them because they're our gate to paradise. So the same charity organization that I'm talking about here, for instance, there's another activity which is going to villages to help usar faqīra, poor families. by fixing their roofs and digging wells and so on. And those charity trips are then explicitly framed here in this instance, for instance, as caravans to paradise. So here you have two ideas: poverty as something to be overcome versus poverty as a given and even needed. And I would say from the get-go here that this constitutes a central tension that accompanies charity practices. So beyond this, I would say that poverty raises a whole field of ethical questions and tensions. And in taking a dive into the Islamic tradition today, I'm less interested in definitive answers. So the Qur'an says X, Y, Z about poverty, but I'm more interested in how Islam invites us to think about poverty. So again, the questions that it poses, the ethical dilemmas that it invites us to grapple with. Now, before we get to definitions and the very question of what actually constitutes poverty, we can note that poverty occupies a central place in Islamic ethics. It's one of the first social issues the Quran addresses, beginning with some of the earliest revelations received by the Prophet Muhammad. As Michael Bonner, a scholar of Islamic studies, notes, the poor, however defined, are the objects of urgent and repeated concern in the Quran. So the poor are addressed in hundreds of Quranic verses. The Quran, some would say, provides a blueprint for a new social order in which the poor will be treated more fairly than before. So again, not necessarily eradicating poverty, but a different treatment of the poor. At the same time, the general view is that neither wealth nor poverty are inherently good or bad, because both are attributed to God. So sometimes we then find the concept of the blessings of poverty or the blessings of the poor, the idea that the poor are actually better off than the rich. So there are multiple hadiths, prophetic sayings in canonical collections that state that the poor will enter paradise before the rich. So some versions say, as the one that you see here, 500 years before the rich. This is usually understood to mean that wealth ties you to dunya, to the world. It takes you away from God, it distracts you from God. The poor, therefore, are more receptive to truth, therefore more likely to make it to paradise. But there's also the idea that the rich will have to account for how they spend their wealth, what they have done with their money. And so they have to do all this accounting before they can actually make it into paradise. Another hadith reports that the Prophet said that the majority of people in paradise are those who were poor. So paradise here is imagined as filled with poor or formerly poor people. This particular hadith goes on to state that the Prophet looked into hell and the majority of people there were women. That's a story for another day. But again, here just an imaginary of the poor are the ones that make it to paradise, right? Again, lastly, another hadith that is contested, but that's popular in Sufi circles. The Prophet reportedly having said, "Faqri fahri, my poverty is my pride." Again, all of these just examples of the blessings of poverty, the idea that maybe it's not so bad to be poor, especially if you consider life as transient and you have a larger temporal frame that includes the afterlife. At the same time, there are also negative views expressed in the Islamic tradition. There's a concern that poverty can lead to disbelief. Here, a hadith quotes the Prophet as saying, "Kad al-faqr yakun kufran," so poverty almost can turn into disbelief. This is taken usually to refer to excessive poverty, extreme poverty, that is just too much and overwhelming and leads you down the wrong path. Along the same lines, there's a dua or an invocation, a prayer asking God to protect us from both disbelief and poverty, again, despairing. There's a report of Imam Ali having said that if poverty were a man, he would kill him. Again, all these just examples of poverty not being such a great thing, something we should rather get rid of. And lastly, along the same vein, a hadith that says that the upper hand is better than the lower hand, the upper hand being the one that gives, the lower hand being the one that receives. So it's better to be the one in a position to give charity than to be the one that is on the receiving end. Some 20th and 21st century Muslim thinkers, like, for instance, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who wrote about poverty, talked about poverty as a dangerous social problem, again, one that can lead us down the path towards apostasy and crimes. So again, what I want to just point out here is a certain ambivalence, right? There's concern attached to poverty, but there's concern attached to wealth. Wealth in and of itself is not bad. Poverty can also be a blessing. And ultimately, both poverty and wealth can be trials for human beings. So one supplication that sums this up is asking God to protect us from the trial, the fitna of wealth, and from the trial of poverty, right? Both, again, can be a problem, but both are not inherently good or bad. The last thing I'll say on this question of different views on poverty, or maybe a certain ambivalence surrounding poverty, is that we can see shifts in the Qur'an itself. So for instance, scholars like Goldziher point out that there's an ascetic mood in early Islam, where the aim of life is felicity in the next life, so a more afterlife-oriented understanding of life. And then he makes the point that in the wake of military expeditions, and that brought booty and wealth into the Muslim community, the ascetic tone shifted. The ascetic tone of the first Meccan revelations gave way to more didactic elements within Madanese realism, he says. So a shift already in the Quran, some people would say, from an idealization of poverty or certain value attached to poverty towards a justification of property, for instance. Goldziher speaks of this as a dialectic. So it's not that one replaces the other, but these ideas coexist. And I think they still very much coexist and constitute, as I said earlier, tension that accompanies also charity practices. But now, whether poverty is good or bad, it's a given, it persists. So then charity becomes a key practice for dealing with poverty. And charity also becomes a key site for articulating what poverty is, or for defining poverty. So this takes me to the next point, this question of how is poverty actually defined. So the Quran repeatedly identifies the poor amongst those worthy of charity. This is one of the key verses in the Quran, or the alms, that describes for us who are deserving alms recipients. Different categories of people, including the poor and the needy, including those employed to administer alms. Alms can be used for freeing slaves, for helping those in debt, for those fighting for Allah's cause, for travelers in need. So different categories of worthy recipients. And the two categories of interest to us are al-fuqarāʼ wal-masākīn, the poor and the needy, right? So the Quran doesn't actually provide criteria for identifying either, or doesn't clearly define either, or doesn't help us clearly distinguish between these two categories. But scholars have attempted to tease them apart in various ways. And I just briefly touch on some of these attempts. So al-fuqarāʼ, the poor, are sometimes understood to be those who live in absolute poverty, those who without any help wouldn't be able to scrape together even a day's subsistence, those who have nothing and who cannot or do not work. And the masākīn, on the other hand, would be those who are unable to meet their basic needs. So this could include the working poor, and those who cannot maintain their accustomed level. So what we get here is a relative understanding of poverty. Another view is that the fuqarāʼ are the passive or hidden poor, those who don't ask for anything, and the masākīn are those who are openly poor or those who beg. Yet another view is that the fuqarāʼ are those who are chronically ill or weak, and the masākīn are those who have a sound body. Or another is that the fuqarāʼ are the so-called inner poor, so the poor that we know that are part of the community, versus the masākīn as the more unsettling poor, the outer poor, those whom we may not know. So again, these are the two kind of central terms. Faqir appears 12 times in the Quran, miskin 23 times, but the distinction is not inherently clear from within the Quran. But these are just different attempts to distinguish between different types of poverty, different types of poor people. And what we, I think, already get a sense of here is that there can be then judgments or hierarchies that find their way into these definitions, having to do with who deserves our help. And I'll come back to these judgment calls later. The faqir, again, the most common word for poor in Arabic today, I would say, has a variety of meanings. Literally, the faqir is the one who has a broken back, but it's a term that generally refers to material need and poverty, but can also refer to something more spiritual, like the concept of al-faqir ila rahmatillah, someone who's in need of God's mercy, indicating an essential distinction from God who's al-ghani, the rich and self-sufficient. So Sufis would call themselves faqir not only because many renounced worldly possessions as part of their spiritual practice, but also to emphasize their utter spiritual dependence on God's mercy. And we'll return to this idea at the end. As a side note, I just want to say that the term faqir or fakir enters into English language as early as 1609 and referred and still refers not only to Muslim beggars, but in British-ruled India also came to refer to Hindu ascetics, and still today is used to also refer to Hindu monks and holy men. So I think this is just an interesting side note. Classical jurists in the Islamic tradition differed on criteria for defining rich and poor. And this takes us again back to this idea of absolute or relative poverty. These definitions have different implications for charity. So the Hanafi school of law, for instance, favored an approach that is based on identifying and acting on some absolute measure of poverty. So there's a poverty threshold defined by ownership of property up to a certain limit or nisab. And that nisab is defined by the Prophet for different types of poverty, they would say. Sorry, different types of property. Whereas the Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and the Jafari school of Twelver Shi'ism applied a needs test rather than a property test to determine whether someone qualifies as poor. So Shafi'i, for instance, said that if you may have money but still not have enough to cover your family expenses, again, not a matter of absolute numbers, but a matter of actual needs. So the majority of scholars has favored an approach based on this relative rather than absolute notion of poverty. And these questions, I would just say, are still at play today. So Islamic charity organizations in Egypt today sometimes work also with secular concepts of poverty, like the USAID definition of poverty. So they will say, okay, if I have to define poverty, it's making less than $2 or $3 a day. Then by definition, you are poor. But they will also generally consider other factors such as market prices, expenses, medical needs. So, if someone makes £5,000 a month, but spends 4,000 on medicine, they might still be poor. So it's a complicated math game and judgment call. And it shows, I think, how messy it can be on the ground to try to fulfill the divine imperative to attend to the poor and needy. Charity organizations in Egypt will often inquire into individual circumstances and do home visits and try to assess need and get a sense of families' expenses, for instance. So mostly what's at work is a relative understanding of poverty, but again, there's a constant negotiation and judgment call. Decisions being made daily of who actually qualifies as deserving alms and who qualifies as poor and in need. So this takes us to the ethics of charity. This is just an image from Cairo with donation boxes in front of a mosque. One for the building of the mosque, which can also qualify as sadaqa ghairiya, a kind of donation with lasting effects. Zakat al-fitr as a kind of donation, small donation at the end of Ramadan, a set amount that everybody ought to give, including the poor. and then regular zakat, which only those with a certain amount of savings need to do. So just to get a setup here for thinking about the ethics and economies of almsgiving and of charity. So speaking about the ethics of charity, I want to just briefly note that there's also something we could call an ethics of receiving, which is, there's less written about it, but I think it's interesting to tease out. The question of whether the poor too have obligations. Some people would say, for instance, that as much as possible, even if you're poor, you ought to dress well. You should work if you can. And in spiritual terms, you should rely on and trust in God. So there's an ethics of receiving, and often begging is a concern. The Qur'an notably lists as-sa'ilun, those who ask, as worthy recipients in some verses. But in, especially the era of the modern state and labor needs, disdain towards beggars is growing or has been growing. So one of my interlocutors in Egypt, for instance, who's he's a carpenter, but he's also a pious Muslim who channels other people's alms towards those in need, presented to me a spiritual hierarchy of sorts. So he said the best class of the poor are those who don't ask for anything. God provides to them. The second class are the ones that ask, and those are the ones he helps. And then the third, the highest, are those that, the lowest, the third, the lowest, are those that make it a profession. And those are the ones you shouldn't give to, right? That make begging a profession. So begging is bad. Begging, again, despite as-sa'ilun as a category in the Quran, is met with disdain. That's just briefly on, how do you have to position yourself as a receiver? Turning to the ethics of giving, almsgiving is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, besides the profession of faith, prayer, fasting, and the pilgrimage. Early Quranic revelations emphasize generosity and almsgiving, probably more than any other kind of activity. There's a general agreement between the 4 Sunni schools and major schools of Shiite jurisprudence that charity is key for dealing with poverty. What is almsgiving and charity? There are, again, 2 terms, zakat and sadaqa. In the Quran, they're used interchangeably. In fact, the verse I showed you earlier speaks of sadaqat, even though it refers to obligatory alms. So they're used synonymously, interchangeably, but they become sorted out by the reign of Osman already, so 650 CE, where on the one hand you have voluntary almsgiving, sadaqa, and you have obligatory almsgiving, zakat. Zakat means giving annually 2.5% of one's wealth and other percentages of other types of property to charity. In some places, this is done by way of the state, Malaysia, Libya, Pakistan, for instance. In other places, in Egypt, for instance, people either give through charity organizations or they give directly. The one point I want to make about almsgiving in relation to poverty, that what's noteworthy and important about charity, I find, at least how it unfolds in the kinds of circles that I studied in Egypt, is that charity and almsgiving can often be unapologetically self-interested. What I mean by that is that, of course, mercy is a key virtue in the Islamic tradition. Almost every Quranic surah begins with calling upon God as Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. And these are traits one ought to emulate, right? You ought to be compassionate. On the other hand, quite often, my interlocutors in Egypt, so the volunteers and other pious Muslims who dedicate themselves to giving to the poor, often explicitly distinguish what they do from what they take to be a Christian approach to charity. And this is a stereotypical understanding, but for them, a Christian approach to charity is love-driven, compassion-driven. You care about the poor, you love your neighbor. And they will say, for us, it's different. It's not about whether you feel compassion, whether you feel bad for the poor, whether your heart is moved to give, but we do it because it's a duty. It's a divinely prescribed duty. We do what God told us to do. Often when I talk about this, I have to say, in kind of North American or European context, people have strong reactions to this. They think this is very uncompassionate and selfish and instrumentalizing. But I would argue that, there's actually certain effects that come into play that are worth considering. To begin with, if this whole thing doesn't ride on compassion, you don't have to worry about what people call compassion fatigue. More important, this understanding of duty frees recipients from having to perform need, evoke pity, and be grateful. So alms here are really directed not at the poor, but lillah, to God. And some people will explicitly use the language of trading with God. Other people don't like that language, but the idea of tagarama rabbina, trading with God by way of giving to the poor, is again not something people would be ashamed of. So zakat, again, unapologetically is understood as a mode of purification. It means purification. You purify your remaining wealth. And there's the hope for a reward in the afterlife. Again, the idea that the poor will take you by the hand and lead you into paradise. Recall that the majority of inhabitants of paradise are formerly poor people. So the idea is often that the poor are our gate to paradise. The idea that ultimately you're giving to God means also that giving should be done in secret, ideally. It shouldn't be about the social realm, social recognition, prestige. It shouldn't be about being thanked, shouldn't be about performing your piety. But it's, again, something you should direct to God, lillah. So you get an idea then in Islam that you also get in the Bible, for instance, this idea that your left hand shouldn't even know what your right hand is giving. So all of that is to say one ought to give, but how to give and who to give to. Again, this is something that's negotiated on the ground, especially in contexts where people give alms directly. There's a constant distinction one has to make between the deserving and the undeserving poor. The undeserving poor often are taken to be those who are fit to work but don't work. So again, there's this disdain for beggars. But beggars can also disrupt this by calling for, so if a beggar in Egypt, for instance, says haga lillah, something for God, the beggar erases himself as a beggar and it becomes again a channel for giving to God. So there's interesting dynamics that can kick in with this very logic of giving to God. And also because we need the poor, one also sometimes needs beggars as kind of easy people to give to. But so again, a distinction that's being negotiated by people, who's deserving, who's not deserving. Another distinction or negotiation is the question whether you should give to the near poor first before you give to the far poor. Whether you should attend to poor kin first, poor neighbors, poor Muslims in one's own town. There's a hadith, for instance, that says that you're not a believer if your stomach is full and the neighbor next to you is starving. So again, a kind of prioritization of giving to the near poor. There's another question in negotiation around whether zakat can only go to poor Muslims or also to poor non-Muslims. I think I would say a majority opinion is that it can only go to Muslims, but some point out that the Qur'anic verse I showed you speaks of the poor and needy without reference to faith. And people like Qardawi, for instance, argued that Muslims should have a preference, but nothing bars non-Muslims from also receiving zakat and certainly other forms of charity. So again, disagreement around who to give to, but agreement that charity is a fundamental duty in Islam. An idea that giving doesn't happen necessarily out of compassion, although it might be accompanied by compassion, but there's an idea of distributive justice. There's the idea that the poor have a right. It's a Qur'anic idea, that the Qur'anically based idea that the poor have a right in a share of the wealth of those who are better off. So a Qur'anic concept of a due share, a rightful share. And again, this takes us back to this idea of distributive justice that is really divine justice. So then charity can be understood as part of a larger, what people have called a Qur'anic economics that aims to prevent the concentration of wealth, and that goes hand in hand, for instance, with a ban on charging interest. In modern times, unsurprisingly, then, Muslim writings on charity sometimes include critiques of capitalism. The Muslim Brotherhood thinker Sayyid Qutb wrote about a God-given moral economy that reigns in the excesses of capitalism. He wrote against the lovers of luxury. He believed that charity helps reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. Thinkers like the Egyptian Mustafa Mahmoud, who started out as a Marxist and then wrote about why he rejected Marxism and became a Muslim thinker, intellectual, describes Islam as a middle way that protects us from getting too big of a gap between the rich and the poor. And he also here refers to this idea of haqq al-faqir, this idea of a rightful share that is owed to the poor, that encourages redistribution of wealth. So again, generally, Islam is not anti-wealth. It's not anti-private property either. It sets prescriptions on the accumulation of use of wealth. And ultimately, wealth offers only brief enjoyment, but in the absence of concern for the poor will lead to hellfire. Questions of poverty, charity, and justice are continuously renegotiated. They're not static. There's studies of how Islamic charity can become instrumentalized by states. There's interesting studies on how charity has become neoliberalized in some contexts. So the idea that rather than giving a fish to a man, you should teach the man to fish. The idea that you need to help the poor help themselves has transformed almsgiving and charity in some contexts. Mona Atiyah writes about this extensively. In my own work, I was interested in how charity gets rethought, renegotiated, reimagined against the backdrop of a revolution. 2011 in Egypt, I was working with people who give food to the poor, and I engaged in charity. And just down the street at Tahrir Square, people were calling for social justice and marching under the banner of the poor first and fuqarāʻ awwalan. So I was interested in how these things get negotiated against each other, these different understandings of poverty that come into play. And just to give you one example of how this, kind of interesting convergences, this is Sheikh Salah, who unfortunately died during COVID, who, ran a khidma, a Sufi space of giving, spent every day cooking and giving to the poor at the Sayyid Zainab Mosque in Cairo, was very interested in politics and economics, but also very, very spiritually inclined. And so he, for instance, when we talked about food and the very duty to give food to the poor and needy, coined the term that food is a divine minimum wage. Food is again an interesting convergence of revolutionary terms, people calling for a minimum wage. For him, again, this idea of a rightful share, so food is a divine minimum wage. All that is to say, these things are not static, they get renegotiated in political and economic contexts, and it can be certainly ways in which the spiritual and the material come to merge, such as in this very concept of a divine minimum wage. But lastly, I just want to turn to the idea of spiritual poverty briefly. So I think across the monotheistic religions, we have an idea of spiritual poverty that challenges materialist understandings of what poverty even means. The important idea here is that we are all poor in relation to God, who is Al-Ghani, which is one of God's 99 names. The 99 names describe God's attributes, and some of these attributes humans ought to emulate, and others describe an absolute difference. In this case, God is the only one who is rich and free of need, and all humans, by contrast, are poor. So we've seen, that sometimes physical and material poverty, there's ambivalence around them, but spiritual poverty, which includes this awareness of dependence on God, is encouraged. So key again is this recognition of dependency. But I would say that the line between spiritual and material isn't always clear. So having possessions, not having possessions can enhance one's awareness of dependence on God. So again, this is the idea that material poverty or even voluntary poverty can be an important step on the spiritual path because it reminds you continuously of your dependence on God. So Al-Ghazali in Kitab al-Faqr wal-Zuhd, the book of poverty and renunciation, talks about poverty both as a spiritual state, but also how material wealth can be a barrier between the seeker and God. So the zuhd, the ascetic, is the one who renounces this world in favor of God and the hereafter. And so for him, actual poverty is a foundational stage needed for spiritual development. So we're back to this, appreciation for asceticism and the ascetic mood in early Islam. A number of scholars like Goldziher, Nicholson, and Massignon translate zuhd as asceticism, but Leah Kinberg says this is actually too vague in general a translation. So she looks at Islamic literature of the first centuries and argues that the term doesn't refer to a particular group of ascetics that somehow withdraw from the world, but it rather refers to an actual central ethos of the Islamic tradition that applies to all Muslims, at least again in the first centuries. So she says zuhd is not something destined for a selected, limited group of people, but rather a code of behavior that should be followed by any pious Muslim. And I will, I'll wrap up with this because I find it to be a provocative point. It gets us to think about the fact that a total rejection of the world, of a dunya, for most people is not possible and not desirable. So it's not about abandoning the world, but it's about cultivating a certain indifference to it, and specifically to wealth and possessions. Again, the goal being that one shouldn't be enslaved to property or see money as a goal in itself. Kinberg talks about early Islam, but I think this raises the question of how people live with this ethos in the midst of hyper-capitalism. There are different ethical orientations that come out of the Islamic tradition and that are tied to these concepts of poverty and charity that I try to lay out today. And I think the very act of charity and practices like it'am, the giving of food, and certain modes of almsgiving are precisely about cultivating this continuous detachment from a dunya and from wealth and property. So I will leave you with the image of another khidmah, again, a Sufi space of giving. This is run by, this space is again in Cairo. It's run by a woman I call Noura. It's a space of giving and circulation. So people come in, they sleep here, they eat here, they get fed, the dervishes that come in, Darawish, but there are also all kinds of people from Cairo that need shelter. So when I first met Noura and tried to understand this space of giving, I was clearly too attached to a materialist logic. And I asked her, who do you serve? Who are the people that come here? Are these mostly poor people? Are these, fuqarāʻ masākīn? Are those the people that come here? Noura's response, and this I'll end with, was that this is a completely misguided question because we are all poor. Again, the notion that we are all poor in relation to God. And again, whether you are the one that gives or receives. And again, I find this to be a provocative concept that is alive and well in certain, Islamic Muslim circles in places like Egypt. And I think it's an important understanding of poverty to keep in the picture when we think about poverty, which tends to be, many of us, I would think, tend to be overly attached to a materialist understanding of poverty. And so keeping this idea that we are all poor in the picture, to me, is an important kind of corrective. Thank you so much. I will end here.